Long before stone temples rose above the Mesopotamian plain, before kings carved their names into clay and fire hardened their words against forgetting, the land between the rivers was already old. Beneath the ruins of Uruk and Eridu lie layers of silt, ash, and compacted earth, each one a quiet record of lives lived, abandoned, and resumed. Archaeologists uncover cities that seem to appear already complete. Canals aligned, workshops organized, rituals standardized, as though the idea of beginning had passed long before writing learned how to remember it. The earliest tablets do not tremble with uncertainty. They count, they assign, they regulate. They speak of gods already in place, of kingship already descended, of a world already in motion. Flood deposits at multiple sites interrupt the soil like pauses in a long breath, while king lists stretch backward into spans of time too large to feel human. Even the myths that survive do not describe creation from nothing, but rearrangement, inheritance, and control. Water exists before the gods. Order exists before explanation. Writing itself arrives not as an invention, but as a stabilization, a way to hold together what has already endured loss. And somewhere within that silence, a question lingers without form. Why does the oldest written civilization never pause to say how everything began? What kind of past leaves behind systems without origins, knowledge without stories, authority without a first moment? Was something erased by catastrophe, softened by repetition, or quietly set aside by those who learned that survival mattered more than memory? Tonight, we drift into that unanswered space, following clay, water, and shadow where certainty thins and continuity replaces origin. Welcome to the Cryptic Realm channel. If these reflections draw you closer, settle in, breathe slowly, and let the ancient quiet speak. Ahead, the rivers continue to flow, and the first beginning waits, just beyond where words ever learned to reach. The land itself offers the first contradiction. Southern Mesopotamia does not resemble a birthplace waiting to be awakened. It stretches low and wide beneath an immense sky, shaped by the slow wandering of the Tigris and Euphrates, rivers that do not simply flow, but negotiate with the earth, sometimes nourishing it, sometimes erasing it. Each year, water spreads beyond its channels, laying down fine silt that blurs yesterday's boundaries. Villages disappear quietly beneath mud. New ground forms where none existed before. In such a landscape, permanence is an illusion learned slowly, and memory must compete with the patience of the soil. When the earliest Sumerian cities emerge from this environment, they do not feel experimental. Uruk appears with monumental precincts, carefully planned streets, and administrative buildings already humming with routine. Eridu, near what was once a marshy shoreline, holds temples rebuilt again and again on the same sacred footprint, as if continuity mattered more than originality. These places do not announce themselves as beginnings. They behave like inheritors. The bricks are standardized, the rituals repeat with confidence. Tools, seals, and measures suggest agreement rather than invention. It is tempting to imagine a dramatic moment when people first decided to become Sumerian, when cities were founded with intention and memory was born alongside walls. Yet nothing in the archaeological record supports such clarity. Beneath the first urban layers lie older villages, then earlier camps, then traces that grow faint and uneven. The transition is not a step, but a thickening, life pressing more densely into the same ground until complexity becomes unavoidable. Civilization here does not arrive, it accumulates. This accumulation carries an unsettling implication. If there was no sharp threshold between before and after, then the need to explain a beginning may never have arisen. For people whose lives unfolded within gradual change, the world would not feel newly made. It would feel already given. Rivers had always flooded. Fields had always been reclaimed. The sky had always moved in patterns reliable enough to trust. In such a rhythm, asking when it all started might feel as strange as asking when the river first decided to flow. Writing appears late in this process, and when it does not behave like a newborn tool. The earliest inscriptions do not hesitate. They do not search for symbols. They record transactions, offerings, rations, labor assignments. Each sign presses into clay with certainty, as though the categories it represents were already settled in speech and practice. Writing freezes a system already functioning. It does not describe how that system came to be. The gods who populate these early texts share the same quality of arrival without introduction. They are addressed as established forces, each governing a domain that feels long assigned. Water, wind, wisdom, fertility. These are not explained, only managed. Even divine genealogies stretch backward into abstraction, dissolving into unnamed forces rather than converging on a first cause. The universe they inhabit is not young. It carries weight. This sense of weight deepens when one considers how time itself is handled. The earliest kings rule for spans so vast they resist human comprehension. Tens of thousands of years pass without comment. The language does not shift to warn the reader. These reigns are written with the same calm precision as those of later, historically verifiable rulers. Time does not narrow toward a beginning. It opens outward, receding into distance without resolution. Such numbers are often dismissed as symbolic, but symbolism alone does not explain their placement. Why anchor the memory of kingship in durations that dissolve ordinary scale? Perhaps because duration becomes a substitute for origin? When the starting point is inaccessible, stretching time backward becomes a way to gesture toward loss. Immense reigns do not explain the past, they signal how far away it is. The land itself reinforces this reading. Excavations reveal flood layers cutting through habitation levels, sudden deposits of silt where daily life once unfolded. These are not myths, but interruptions written into earth. They suggest moments when continuity failed, when memory may have thinned to survival alone. After such events, rebuilding would not begin with stories of creation. It would begin with restoring what worked, with repeating what had proven reliable before everything went wrong. In that context, silence around a first beginning begins to feel less like omission and more like adaptation. A society shaped by repetition and recovery learns where to place its attention. It records what maintains balance: calendars, rituals, boundaries, obligations. It does not linger on what lies beyond recovery. To do so might invite doubt in a world where doubt could be dangerous. And so the Sumerian record opens onto a world already in motion, already ordered enough to require management. The absence of an origin story is not dramatic. It is quiet, embedded in confidence. Yet beneath that confidence lies a tension that does not resolve. If writing captures only what survives stabilization, then something essential preceded it. Something shaped these systems before they were ever pressed into clay. What kind of world taught humanity how to organize itself before it learned how to remember? What survives into writing is never neutral. Clay remembers only what hands choose to press into it, and those hands belong to institutions that value stability over curiosity. In early Sumer, writing did not belong to storytellers or wanderers. It belonged to temples, storehouses, and palaces, places where continuity was not an abstract idea, but a daily necessity. Grain had to be counted. Labor had to be assigned. Rituals had to occur at the correct moment, or the balance between heaven and earth might tilt in unseen ways. Within such a world, memory became selective by design. The earliest tablets feel almost austere in their restraint. They do not ask questions. They do not explain why a god governs a river, or why a king stands between the people and the divine. They assume these things as given. This assumption is not naive. It reflects a worldview shaped by repetition. When an action has been performed correctly for generations, Its origin fades in importance. What matters is that it continues to work. Writing emerges here as an extension of habit, not a challenge to it. This may explain why Sumerian texts sound as though they enter a conversation already underway. Hymns praise gods without introducing them. Administrative lists track systems without describing their creation. Even legal traditions appear framed as restorations rather than innovations, as if justice itself had always existed and merely needed to be realigned. The language carries no excitement of discovery, it carries confidence. Language itself deepens this impression. Sumerian, in its written form, arrives fully capable of abstraction. It distinguishes ownership, obligation, time, and hierarchy with precision. Early writing systems often struggle, relying heavily on pictorial hints, their meanings fragile and context-bound. Yet Sumerian signs operate like tools already tested. They slot into place efficiently, layering meaning through prefixes and suffixes as though the underlying concepts had long been rehearsed in speech. This does not look like a beginning. It looks like preservation. When language behaves this way, it reveals something about the culture that shaped it. Words do not pause to reflect on themselves. There is no myth explaining how naming began, no reverence for the first speaker who imposed order on sound. Speech exists because it functions. It organizes labor. It encodes ritual. It binds community. In such a framework, origins are not sacred mysteries. They are irrelevant details. Yet irrelevance does not mean ignorance. It may signal proximity. People living close to a beginning rarely feel compelled to name it. Only after distance grows does the desire for explanation intensify. When continuity remains unbroken, the past feels like an extension of the present. The world simply is. It is only after rupture, after collapse, displacement, or loss, that the question of where everything came from gains urgency. Hints of such rupture linger at the edges of Sumerian memory. Flood narratives circulate quietly, not as stories of creation, but as accounts of survival. They speak of preservation, of lists gathered, of life carried through water rather than born from it. Humanity in these stories is not young, it is already established and therefore vulnerable. The catastrophe does not mark the start of time. It marks a boundary beyond which memory struggles to reach. This boundary reshapes how time is felt. After a break, what came before becomes distant, compressed, symbolic. Numbers swell. Reigns stretch into the tens of thousands. Vast duration replaces detailed recollection. Time becomes a language for loss. When the exact sequence of events can no longer be traced, magnitude stands in its place. The deeper the silence, the larger the numbers grow. Such inflation is not deception. It is adaptation. A culture that senses its past slipping beyond clarity may choose not to invent precision. Instead, it gestures toward depth. The king list does not lie when it extends reigns into impossibility. It signals that the beginning lies somewhere beyond human scale. The first kings do not stand at the dawn of time. They stand after something else, after a world stable enough to sustain authority long before it was recorded. This perspective reframes the absence of a creation story. Rather than a missing chapter, it becomes a threshold. Writing does not cross it because writing itself is a response to what comes after. It emerges when systems grow dense enough to require external memory, when oral tradition can no longer carry the weight of complexity alone. At that moment, the deepest past is already beyond reach. Temples and scribal schools reinforce this narrowing of memory. Texts are copied faithfully, generation after generation, with reverence for accuracy. Variations are corrected. Canon hardens. What survives does so intact, but only within the boundaries already set. Stories that do not serve function fade naturally through disuse. Over time, silence becomes tradition. The absence of a beginning no longer feels like a gap. It feels normal. Later cultures inherit this silence without questioning it. They translate Sumerian texts, adapt their gods, refine their rituals, yet the missing origin remains missing. Each inheritance carries forward not only what was written, but what was never asked. Authority benefits from this continuity. A world that appears eternal does not invite challenge. If order has always existed, then current hierarchies feel inevitable. Still, a tension hums beneath the surface. Flood layers remain in the soil. Long rains stretch the imagination. Gods arrive without birth. These are not answers. They are seams where memory strains. They suggest a past shaped by interruption, where survival took precedence over explanation. If so, then the silence around the first beginning is not accidental. It is the imprint of a civilization that learned, perhaps painfully, that remembering everything can be dangerous, and that continuity sometimes requires forgetting. What then was lost when forgetting became necessary, and how deeply does that loss shape everything that followed? The gods of Sumer do not enter the world the way creators usually do. They do not step into emptiness and speak reality into being. When they appear in the texts, the universe is already breathing, already divided into sky, earth, and the restless waters between. The divine figures arrive into a structure that seems to predate them, taking positions rather than forging foundations. This quiet detail shifts the entire weight of the narrative. Authority here is not born, it is inherited. In the oldest myths, water exists before personality. Primordial forces move without names, dense and active, long before gods claim dominion. When names finally emerge, they do not announce a first moment. They assign responsibility. One god oversees wind, another wisdom, another fertility or the flow of rivers. Their power lies in management, not creation. Even conflict among the gods does not produce existence, it reorganizes it. Order is negotiated, wrestled into alignment, not summoned from nothing. This becomes especially clear in the story later known as Enuma Elish, often described as a creation epic. Yet its opening offers no blank universe awaiting form. Waters already churn, forces already struggle. The drama that follows is not about birth, but about succession. An older order is defeated, a new authority installed. The cosmos is reshaped to reflect hierarchy and control. Creation here is political. It explains who rules, not why anything exists at all. Such framing carries an unsettling implication. If the gods themselves emerge within an already existing reality, then even divine memory does not extend to a first beginning. The gods have genealogies, rivalries, and histories. They can be displaced. They can fade. Authority shifts among them as it does among kings. This suggests a cosmos governed by time rather than standing outside it. Eternity, in this worldview, is not a static origin. It is ongoing endurance. Human kingship mirrors this pattern with remarkable precision. The king list does not describe the invention of rule. It states that kingship descended from heaven, as though authority arrived ready-made into a world prepared to receive it. The language implies transfer, not genesis. Power moves from city to city, dynasty to dynasty, but it is never created anew. Each ruler inherits a structure already sanctified by age and repetition. This parallel between gods and kings is not accidental. It reflects a society deeply invested in continuity. If both divine and human authority are inherited, then the idea of a first ruler becomes unnecessary, even destabilizing. To name a beginning would be to admit that authority once did not exist, that it could disappear again. In a land shaped by floods and fragile harvests, such an admission would not be comforting. The myths reinforce this caution through tone. They do not marvel at existence. They focus on maintenance, councils convene, decisions are issued, punishments restore balance. The universe is treated like a city-state, governed through negotiation and enforcement rather than wonder. Even catastrophe follows procedure. When destruction looms, lists are made, instructions are given, survival is organized. Flood narratives crystallize this mindset. They do not frame water as the womb of creation, but as a force of interruption. Humanity is not born from the flood. It is preserved through it. The survivor does not discover a new world. He resumes an old one. Animals are gathered not to populate emptiness, but to restore continuity. Knowledge does not begin again. It returns. This emphasis on restoration over origin hints at memory shaped by loss. A society that has experienced erasure learns what to record. It records what ensures survival next time. How to appease gods, how to read omens, how to count time. It does not linger on how everything began, because beginnings offer no guidance when the waters rise again. The absence of divine creation from nothing also reshapes how humans are positioned. They are not portrayed as fragile newcomers into a young universe. They are caretakers within an ancient system. Their role is to maintain balance, perform rituals correctly, and uphold inherited order. Curiosity about ultimate origins becomes secondary to responsibility. Yet even within this restrained worldview, cracks appear. The gods themselves are not immune to forgetting. Older deities recede as new ones rise. Myths absorb earlier traditions, reshaping them to fit current hierarchies. What was once central becomes symbolic, then obscure. If divine knowledge can fade, then the memory of a first beginning becomes even more vulnerable. This layered forgetting suggests that the deepest origin may belong to a divine order no longer remembered, a configuration of belief that did not survive the transitions that followed. The gods we encounter in the texts may already be successors, inheritors of a cosmos rebuilt after loss. Their stories preserve authority, not history. In this light, myth becomes less a window into creation and more a record of adaptation. It explains how order is restored after upheaval, how power is justified, how continuity is asserted despite change. The silence around the first beginning is not an oversight. It is a reflection of priorities shaped by endurance. If even the gods arrive too late to remember the origin, then the question shifts quietly but profoundly. What kind of event, or series of events, could push both human and divine memory beyond reach? And if the first beginning lies outside the grasp of myth itself, what traces might still linger in the world beneath the stories, waiting to be sensed rather than named? Time in the Sumerian imagination does not behave like a straight path with a visible starting line. It stretches, folds, and recedes, growing heavier the farther one looks back. The past does not narrow toward clarity, it expands into vastness. This sensation emerges most strongly in the way years are counted. The earliest reigns recorded in the king list extend beyond human scale, dissolving any comfortable sense of proportion. These are not marginal embellishments. They stand at the very threshold of recorded history, calmly presented, unmarked as extraordinary. Modern readers often attempt to domesticate these numbers, explaining them as symbolic, ritual, or astronomical. Such explanations may offer partial insight, yet they leave a deeper question untouched. Why are these immense spans placed where beginnings are usually expected? Why anchor the memory of kingship in durations that seem to refuse comprehension? The text does not appear confused. It appears deliberate. Time itself becomes a language, one that gestures toward distance rather than detail. When memory cannot reach a starting point, it often compensates by enlarging scale. Vast time does not explain what happened, it signals how inaccessible it has become. The earliest kings do not stand at the dawn of creation, they stand after something else, something already ancient enough to make their reigns feel like continuation rather than origin. In this way, time becomes a veil rather than a bridge. This veiled past resonates with the physical landscape. Southern Mesopotamia offers no stable horizon. Rivers shift course, marshes expand and contract. Settlements must adapt or vanish. Over generations, the ground itself records interruption. Excavations reveal abrupt changes in sediment, layers of silt cutting across living floors, moments when habitation stops and then resumes elsewhere. These are not isolated events. They repeat with quiet persistence. Such interruptions complicate memory. When disruption occurs frequently enough, individual catastrophes blur together. What remains is not a precise sequence of events, but a pattern. Destruction followed by rebuilding, loss followed by restoration. In such a rhythm, the idea of a single, pristine beginning loses relevance. Life does not feel like a story with a clear opening. It feels like a cycle endured. This cyclical experience of time shapes how the past is narrated. Instead of tracing origins, Sumerian texts trace succession. Dynasties replace one another. Authority moves from city to city. Order falters and is restored. The emphasis lies on continuity across breaks, not on what existed before the first break. Even catastrophe becomes a phase rather than an endpoint. The flood narratives crystallize this approach. They do not describe the birth of the world. They describe its near erasure. Humanity survives not because it is new, but because it is preserved. The survivor is instructed, not inspired. He follows procedures, gathers resources, and waits. When the waters recede, life resumes along familiar lines. The catastrophe compresses memory rather than resetting it. Compression has consequences. Details are lost. Explanations fade. What survives are practices that work. Over time, these practices harden into tradition, detached from the circumstances that produced them. The deeper past becomes not a story but an assumption. It is felt rather than known. This feeling may explain why Sumerian texts rarely look backward with curiosity. To ask too much about what came before could destabilize a fragile equilibrium. In a world where survival depends on reading signs correctly and maintaining ritual precision, curiosity about ultimate origins offers little practical value. The future demands attention. The past beyond recovery does not. Writing reflects this orientation with striking clarity. It records cycles of labor, calendars of festivals, sequences of offerings. Time is measured, divided, and managed, not explained. Even celestial observation follows this pattern. The earliest astronomical records do not speculate about the birth of the stars. They track their movement, integrate them into ritual schedules, and extract omens from their regularity. The sky is not new, it is reliable. Reliability fosters confidence. Confidence reduces the need for explanation. When patterns repeat across generations, their origin fades into irrelevance. The stars rise whether or not one remembers who first noticed them. The river floods whether or not one recalls when it first carved its path. In such a worldview, beginnings are not anchors of meaning. Balance is. Yet beneath this calm lies an unresolved tension. The very need to measure, to count, to record suggests an awareness of fragility. Time is tracked because it can be disrupted. Rituals are specified because deviation carries risk. The world may feel ancient, but it is not assumed to be safe. Order must be maintained actively. This maintenance mindset leaves little room for nostalgia. There is no longing for a golden age, no lament for a lost paradise. What came before is not idealized, it is obscured. Silence replaces sentiment. The first beginning becomes something neither celebrated nor mourned, simply unreachable. As later cultures inherit these records, the silence travels with them. It becomes more noticeable only when distance increases, when continuity finally fractures beyond repair. At that point, the absence of an origin begins to feel unsettling. Questions emerge that earlier generations never needed to ask. For the Sumerians, however, time did not invite such questions. It flowed, retreated, returned. It carried scars but also patterns. Their texts reflect a world experienced as ongoing rather than initiated. And within that ongoing motion, the first beginning dissolves, not because it was hidden, but because it no longer served the task at hand. What remains is a quiet challenge left for those who come later. When time itself resists a starting point, what does it mean to search for one at all? Beneath the written surface of Sumerian memory lies another archive, one that does not speak in sentences or myths, but in layers of earth. Archaeology approaches this archive slowly, peeling back time not as a story, but as accumulation. Each stratum reveals not a beginning, but a continuation interrupted. Houses are built atop earlier foundations. Temples rise where temples once stood. The same sacred ground is claimed again and again, even when everything else shifts around it. At sites like Uruk and Eridu, the earliest monumental structures do not rest on untouched soil. They sit above traces of earlier occupation, villages, hearths, and modest buildings that suggest organization long before urban scale emerged. These earlier layers do not announce themselves as the first step toward civilization. They appear already adapted, already skilled at negotiating water, soil, and seasonal rhythm. The move toward cities feels less like a leap and more like compression, life concentrating until administration becomes necessary. This compression complicates the idea of an origin. When change unfolds gradually, without a clear rupture, memory has little reason to mark a starting line. The people living through it experience continuity, not transformation. To them, the present feels like an extension of what has always been. Only later observers, searching for milestones, impose the language of beginnings. Yet the ground also records moments when continuity fails. Flood deposits slice sharply through habitation layers, carrying debris from elsewhere, flattening structures, sealing objects in place. These events do not arrive with explanation. They simply occur, and when life resumes above them, it does so altered. Settlement patterns shift. Building styles change. Some techniques vanish while others persist. Knowledge survives unevenly. Such uneven survival reshapes culture in subtle ways. Skills that can be demonstrated endure. Techniques that require long explanation fade. Over time, practices become detached from their original context, retained for their effectiveness rather than their story. This process leaves behind a civilization that feels ancient yet oddly opaque, rich in function but sparse in narrative about its own emergence. The repeated rebuilding of temples offers a powerful example. At Eridu, successive shrines are constructed one atop another, each aligned with the same axis, each honoring the same sacred space. This persistence suggests a memory that outlives material forms. Even when structures collapse or are deliberately buried, the idea of the place remains. Sacredness here is not tied to novelty. It is tied to endurance. Endurance, however, comes at a cost. When a site is rebuilt too many times, its earliest layers become inaccessible, crushed under weight and time. The physical beginning becomes unreachable without destroying what followed. Preservation and recovery exist in tension. To maintain continuity, something must remain buried. This tension mirrors the silence in the texts. Writing stabilizes the present by selecting what deserves to survive. Archaeology reveals what selection leaves behind. Between them lies a gap filled with inference rather than certainty. The earth shows that civilization did not begin cleanly. It accumulated, fractured, and reassembled repeatedly. Environmental forces intensify this pattern. Southern Mesopotamia is not a forgiving landscape. Rivers shift unpredictably. Salinization threatens fields. Droughts and floods arrive without warning. Communities that survive such conditions learn to adapt quickly. They favor practices that can be taught and repeated under pressure. They abandon what proves fragile. Over generations, this adaptation produces a culture that values resilience over explanation. Knowledge becomes practical. Memory becomes compressed. The past is not erased, but it is simplified. What survives is what can be carried forward when conditions change suddenly. This process also shapes identity. If ancestors lived through repeated disruption, their stories may narrow to what matters most: how to rebuild, how to appease forces beyond control, how to restore balance. The question of where everything began may feel irrelevant in comparison. The world does not appear as something newly created. It appears as something repeatedly threatened. Archaeology does not confirm a single catastrophe responsible for this mindset. Instead, it reveals a pattern of instability stretching across millennia. No single flood layer explains the silence. Rather, it is the accumulation of many interruptions that thins memory beyond recovery. When loss occurs often enough, the idea of a first loss fades. Only the rhythm of loss remains. In this light, the absence of a first beginning becomes easier to understand. It is not the result of a missing tablet or a suppressed myth. It is the outcome of lived experience. A world shaped by repetition, interruption, and survival does not naturally produce stories of absolute origin. It produces stories of endurance. Yet endurance leaves traces of what it cannot carry. Beneath rebuilt cities, beneath standardized bricks and measured canals, lie fragments of earlier lives that never entered writing. Their tools remain. Their patterns of habitation linger. Their voices are gone. Archaeology listens to this silence, but it cannot translate it fully. The deeper one looks, the more the beginning dissolves into continuity. There is no clean foundation, only layers pressing into one another. Civilization here does not rise from emptiness. It thickens over time. Writing captures that thickened world at a particular moment, freezing it into record while everything beneath remains unresolved. This unresolved depth invites a quiet question. If the ground itself resists a first layer, if every beginning rests on something older, then perhaps the search for an origin misunderstands the nature of the past. What if the first beginning was not a moment, but a process so gradual, so often interrupted, that it left no single point for memory to hold? And if so, what does it mean to keep searching for what the earth itself refuses to isolate? Knowledge in Sumer does not announce itself as discovery. It appears as inheritance. Mathematical systems operate with quiet confidence, calendars unfold in predictable cycles, and measurements align with remarkable consistency. The base 60 system governs time, angles, and ritual order without explanation. There is no story of the first counter who chose 60, no myth celebrating the moment when number became meaningful. The system simply functions as though it had always been there. Such systems do not arise spontaneously. They require testing, correction, and transmission across generations. They demand stability long enough for error to be noticed and refined. When they appear in writing already coherent, they point toward a long period of development that left little trace in text. This development did not need writing to exist. It needed continuity. The same pattern emerges in astronomy. Early Mesopotamian records do not read like tentative observations. They reflect familiarity. Lunar months are tracked. Planetary movements are noted. Eclipses are anticipated and woven into omen literature. The sky is treated as a system that can be read, not a mystery to be unveiled. Each celestial body holds a role within an established order. This confidence challenges the image of a civilization standing at the threshold of knowledge. One would expect uncertainty, experiment, and revision. Instead, the earliest texts present astronomical understanding as something already aligned with ritual, agriculture, and divine interpretation. The heavens do not appear newly discovered. They appear inherited. Inheritance alters the way origins are remembered. When knowledge is passed down orally for long periods, its beginnings become diffuse. Techniques survive longer than the stories that once explained them. Over time, explanation becomes expendable. What remains is practice. This is not ignorance, It is efficiency shaped by experience. Music offers a quiet parallel. A melody can endure for centuries while its composer's name fades. Ritual gestures persist long after their symbolic meaning dissolves. What survives is what works, not why it first appeared. Sumerian knowledge bears this same imprint. It is precise, effective, and anonymous. Writing reinforces this anonymity. Texts rarely claim authorship. Wisdom is attributed to gods or ancient figures whose authority lies beyond challenge. Humans position themselves as transmitters rather than creators. Knowledge flows downward through time, not outward from a point of origin. This posture reflects humility, but it also reflects loss. A culture aware of how easily knowledge can vanish learns not to anchor it too tightly to individuals or moments. Yet this detachment comes at a cost. When systems survive without context, they become opaque. Later generations inherit forms without reasons. They preserve procedures without understanding their origins. Over time, this opacity can harden into tradition. What began as adaptation becomes authority. The absence of explanatory myths around knowledge suggests that explanation itself may have become fragile. If disruption repeatedly thinned memory, then preserving function would take precedence over preserving narrative. Stories fracture easily under pressure. Practices endure. Environmental instability reinforces this preference. Floods, droughts, and shifting rivers do not reward speculation. They reward preparation. Communities that survive learn to value what can be demonstrated and repeated. Knowledge becomes something one does, not something one recounts. Writing then emerges to support this doing, to stabilize it against further loss. This orientation shapes how time is recorded. Calendars align agricultural labor with celestial cycles. Ritual schedules regulate divine appeasement. Everything is oriented toward continuation. The future matters more than the distant past. The question is not where did this system come from, but will it hold? Such pragmatism does not preclude depth. On the contrary, it suggests a deep familiarity with instability. A society that has not experienced loss can afford curiosity about origins. A society that has rebuilt itself repeatedly learns caution. It learns that some questions weaken rather than strengthen. This caution may explain why the first beginning never enters writing. To name an origin is to imply contingency. It suggests that the world could have been otherwise. In a fragile environment, such an implication undermines confidence. Better to treat order as given, timeless enough to trust. Yet even within this restraint, unease remains. The very precision of Sumerian systems hints at long refinement. Long refinement implies time. Time implies memory. Memory implies a past more detailed than what survives. Something has been compressed. This compression leaves traces. In the way numbers swell at the edge of history. In the way gods arrive already governing. In the way the sky is mapped without mythic discovery. Each suggests knowledge that outlived its story. If so, then the silence around beginnings is not emptiness. It is residue. It marks where explanation once existed but no longer fits within the surviving framework. The past has been folded into technique, stripped of narrative weight. The question that follows is subtle but unsettling. When knowledge survives without memory, what else does it carry silently? What assumptions, what forgotten experiences, what losses are encoded into systems we continue to use without understanding their origins? And if Sumer inherited its knowledge this way, how many layers of human experience stand behind it? Unrecorded, shaping civilization while remaining beyond the reach of words. Silence does not spread evenly through a culture. It settles first around what cannot be carried forward without cost. In Sumer, that silence gathers most densely around the question of origin. What remains is not confusion, but a steady redirection of attention toward what must be maintained. Temples become centers not of speculation, but of regulation. They house gods, store grain, coordinate labor, and anchor the calendar. Their authority rests on continuity, not explanation. Scribes trained within these spaces learn early what writing is for. It is not a canvas for wonder, it is a tool for preservation. Tablets record offerings, debts, omens, legal precedents. Each mark pressed into clay serves a function. Accuracy matters. Variation is corrected. Over generations, this discipline hardens into tradition. The written record becomes stable precisely because it narrows its focus. This narrowing shapes what survives. Texts that reinforce order are copied faithfully. Those that complicate it fade quietly through disuse. There is no need for deliberate erasure. Selection happens through repetition. What is useful endures. What is not dissolves. Over time, silence acquires weight. It begins to feel intentional even when it is not. The absence of a creation narrative within this system does not disrupt its coherence. On the contrary, it supports it. A world that appears eternal does not invite doubt. If gods have always governed and kingship has always descended, then current hierarchies feel natural. Authority draws strength from age. The longer it seems to have existed, the less it needs to justify itself. This dynamic does not require conspiracy. It emerges organically from institutional behavior. Structures built to ensure survival resist questions that destabilize their foundations. To ask when authority began is to imply that it could end. In a land where the earth itself is unreliable, such an implication carries risk. Yet even as institutions stabilize memory, they cannot erase the traces of disruption entirely. Flood stories persist. Long rains stretch backward into abstraction. Gods arrive without origin. These elements slip through because they do not threaten function. They hint at depth without demanding explanation. They preserve unease without destabilizing order. Over centuries, this balance becomes normalized. Later generations encounter a record that feels complete. They inherit tablets, rituals, and assumptions together. What is missing does not announce itself as missing. It simply never appears. Silence becomes part of the structure. When later empires take up Sumerian texts, the silence travels with them. Akkadian scribes translate carefully, preserving cadence and meaning. They adapt names and rituals, but they do not insert a beginning. The absence is not corrected because it is not perceived as a flaw. It has already been naturalized. As power shifts from city-states to empires, memory becomes even more centralized. Archives grow. Canon expands. Yet the deepest past remains untouched. New myths elaborate divine conflict and cosmic order, but they still do not cross the threshold into absolute origin. Creation remains rearrangement. Authority remains inherited. Only when continuity finally fractures beyond repair does the silence begin to feel uncomfortable. Collapse, displacement, and loss sharpen the desire for explanation. People living among ruins start asking questions that stable societies never needed to ask. Where did this come from? Why does it exist? What was there before? This shift can be seen in later philosophical traditions that encounter the ancient Near East from a distance. Thinkers raised amid fragments begin to seek first principles. They search for beginnings not because they are closer to them, but because they feel further away. Distance breeds curiosity. Rupture breeds origin stories. In this context, the Sumerian silence takes on new meaning. It reflects not suppression, but proximity. Those closest to recovery focus on survival. Those who inherit recovery after loss begin to wonder about origins. The question of the first beginning is not timeless. It emerges from specific historical conditions. This perspective challenges modern expectations. We assume that every system must have a recoverable origin. When we do not find one, we infer loss or concealment. Yet absence can also reflect sufficiency. A culture confident enough in its continuity may not feel compelled to explain itself. Still, confidence does not eliminate fragility. The very care with which memory is curated reveals awareness of vulnerability. Writing appears when oral tradition can no longer bear the weight of complexity alone. It freezes what remains reliable. Everything else is allowed to fade. This fading leaves behind an archive that feels authoritative and incomplete at the same time. It answers many questions while refusing the most fundamental one: why does this world exist? The record does not ask. It proceeds as though the question itself were misplaced. Perhaps that is the most unsettling aspect. The silence does not accuse. It endures. It suggests a world that learned early on which questions strengthen continuity and which weaken it. And if the first beginning belonged to the latter, then its absence may reveal not ignorance, but wisdom shaped by experience. What kind of experience teaches a civilization that some questions are better left unrecorded? And how deeply does that lesson shape the history that follows? Distance changes the shape of silence. What once felt natural begins to feel deliberate when centuries intervene. For those who lived within Sumer's rhythm, the absence of a first beginning carried no urgency. For those who encountered Sumer later, through fragments, translations, and ruins, that same absence began to press inward, asking to be explained. The question did not arise in Sumer. It arose after Sumer, when continuity thinned and memory became a problem rather than a condition. As Mesopotamian power shifted, the written legacy of Sumer traveled. Akkadian scribes learned the old signs, copied hymns, preserved king lists, and absorbed the structure of a world already ancient to them. They inherited not only words but assumptions. Authority still descended. Gods still governed domains already defined. Time still receded without a visible starting line. The silence remained intact because it had already been woven into the framework. Later, Babylonian scholars elaborated the myths. They expanded divine genealogies, sharpened cosmic drama, and placed greater emphasis on conflict and resolution. Yet even as stories grew more intricate, they stopped short of an absolute beginning. The universe continued to rearrange itself rather than ignite. Waters remained primordial. Order was installed, not created. The deeper past stayed just out of reach. This persistence suggests that silence can be durable. Once naturalized, it resists correction. A missing beginning does not announce itself as a flaw if the system built upon it continues to function. For generations, no one felt compelled to fill the gap because nothing seemed to depend on it. Life went on. Rituals held. The sky kept its rhythm. Only when cultures began to experience distance as loss did the need for origins intensify. Empires fractured. Cities were abandoned. Libraries burned. Knowledge arrived incomplete. In such conditions, explanation becomes a form of comfort. To know where something began is to believe it can be understood fully. Beginnings promise clarity in a world that feels increasingly unstable. This shift is subtle but profound. It marks a change in how time is imagined. Earlier societies experienced time as cycles endured. Later ones began to experience it as a line interrupted. In a broken line, the starting point matters. It anchors meaning. Without it, everything feels provisional. Seen through this lens, the Sumerian silence does not indicate ignorance. It indicates a different relationship to time. Their world did not feel broken enough to demand a narrative of absolute origin. Stability, however precarious, remained sufficient. The past flowed into the present without demanding explanation. Comparisons beyond Mesopotamia reinforce this impression. In Egypt, the cosmos emerges from waters that are themselves eternal. Creation unfolds rather than begins. In the Indus Valley, writing appears without preserved mythic origins at all, leaving behind systems of astonishing refinement with no surviving narrative of how they came to be. Early Chinese thought emphasizes balance, mandate, and cyclical renewal over a singular first moment. These parallels suggest that the absence of a first beginning is not an anomaly. It may be a signature of early civilization itself. Writing emerges after complexity has already taken root. By the time societies need to fix memory in material form, their deepest origins are already embedded in habit rather than story. Habit carries knowledge efficiently, but it sheds explanation. Over generations, the reasons behind practices fade, while the practices themselves endure. This process leaves behind a world that functions without remembering how it learned to function. For those living within it, this is not unsettling. It is normal. The unsettling feeling arises later, when readers approach the past with expectations shaped by different conditions. Modern minds, trained by rupture and rapid change, seek clear beginnings as anchors. When they do not find them, suspicion follows. Perhaps something was erased. Perhaps power intervened. Perhaps the record is incomplete. Yet incompleteness does not always imply removal. Sometimes it reflects boundaries. Writing has limits. It captures what must be preserved to maintain order. It does not necessarily capture what shaped that order in its earliest form. Those shaping forces may belong to a time when memory traveled differently, carried in gesture, routine, and imitation rather than narrative. If this is so, then the silence around the first beginning is not a wound in the record. It is the edge of what the record was ever meant to hold. Beyond it lies a past that shaped civilization without requiring explanation. A past felt through continuity rather than recalled through story. Still, the silence invites reflection. Not because it hides a secret, but because it exposes a difference in how cultures relate to time. The Sumerians trusted repetition. Their successors, living amid fragments, learned to seek origins. Both responses emerge from experience rather than error. And so the question shifts again, becoming less accusatory and more introspective. If the need for beginnings grows strongest when continuity weakens, what does our own urgency reveal about the world we inhabit now? And as we listen to the quiet of the ancient record, are we hearing a failure of memory? Or encountering a boundary that reminds us how recently we learned to ask where everything started? What appears to us as absence may once have felt like certainty. In Sumer, the structures of daily life rested on the assumption that order preceded explanation. People did not wake each morning questioning why the world existed. They questioned whether the gods were appeased, whether the canals would hold, whether the harvest would come on time. Memory in this setting was not a philosophical exercise. It was a practical one, shaped by urgency and repetition. The written record reflects this pressure with remarkable clarity. Administrative tablets multiply far more rapidly than myths. Lists outweigh stories. Names, quantities, dates, and locations dominate the archive. Writing fixes relationships between people, land, and labor, freezing a moment of balance long enough to be managed. It does not linger on how those relationships first formed. It assumes they are already in place. This assumption quietly reshapes the past. History becomes a chain of stewardship rather than a narrative of invention. Each generation inherits a framework and measures its success by how well that framework is preserved. Innovation is framed as restoration. Change is justified as correction. Even conquest presents itself as alignment with an older, truer order rather than rupture. Such language is not accidental. It reflects a world where stability is fragile. To admit that systems were once created is to admit they can be uncreated. In a floodplain where land itself can disappear beneath water, the idea that social order might also dissolve is never far away. Silence around origins functions as reassurance. If order has no recorded beginning, it feels less vulnerable. Over time, this reassurance becomes embedded so deeply that it no longer feels chosen. It feels natural. People inherit a past that simply extends backward, growing larger and quieter as it recedes. The absence of a starting point does not register as a problem. It is the way things have always been remembered. only when distance enters the equation does that memory shift. Later cultures approach Sumer not as participants in its continuity, but as observers standing among remnants. They encounter clay tablets divorced from the rhythms that gave them meaning. What once stabilized life now provokes questions. Where did this system come from? Why does it exist in this form? The same record yields different effects because the conditions surrounding it have changed. Stability has given way to fragmentation. In such a world, origins matter. They promise coherence. They suggest that meaning can be traced, contained, understood. When origins are absent, unease follows. This unease often leads to projection. Later readers imagine lost myths, hidden doctrines, suppressed knowledge. Sometimes such losses did occur. Texts were destroyed, languages faded. But not every silence indicates removal. Some silences were present from the start, shaped by priorities that no longer align with ours. The Sumerian record may represent such a silence. It does not conceal a beginning. It simply never framed one. The first beginning lay beyond the horizon of what needed to be remembered. Writing emerged to serve a world already shaped, already functioning, already carrying scars from disruptions no longer named. This perspective reframes power's role in memory. Institutions did not erase origins to dominate. They ignored them because origins offered no guidance for survival. What mattered was continuity, keeping the world intelligible from one season to the next. Over generations, this focus hardened into tradition. Tradition, however, has a shadow. What it preserves, it also obscures. As practices endure, their reasons fade. Authority remains, but its foundations sink deeper into the past. Eventually, they disappear from view altogether. Archaeology hints at these foundations without recovering them fully. Beneath cities lie older patterns of habitation. Beneath refined systems lie traces of earlier adaptation. Each layer suggests preparation rather than creation. Civilization appears less like a spark and more like a slow compression punctuated by loss. If this is true, then the first beginning was not erased by scribes or rulers. It was overtaken by experience. Too much happened between then and the moment writing began. Memory could not stretch far enough to hold it. The silence that remains is therefore not empty. It is dense with what could not be carried forward. It reminds us that history is shaped as much by forgetting as by remembering. And as we confront that reminder, another question emerges quietly. If the earliest civilizations learned to live without a remembered origin, are we mistaken in believing that meaning must always begin with a beginning? Or is that belief itself a product of a world more fractured than theirs ever was? What endures most stubbornly is not memory itself, but expectation. In Sumer, people moved through a world that already felt arranged, already governed by forces whose authority did not require explanation. The river would rise, the calendar would turn, the gods would receive their offerings. These were not discoveries made anew each generation. They were conditions inherited, trusted because they had held before. Writing enters this world as a response to trust, strained by scale. As communities grow denser and obligations multiply, reliance on personal recollection becomes dangerous. Forgetting one measure, one ritual sequence, one boundary could unbalance an entire system. Clay tablets begin to appear not to tell stories, but to prevent error. They secure continuity by fixing what must not drift. This purpose shapes everything that follows. What writing captures is what people cannot afford to forget. What it leaves behind is what forgetting no longer threatens. The first beginning falls into this latter category. Whatever its nature, it does not guide planting schedules, labor distribution, or divine appeasement. It offers no instruction for surviving the next flood. As such, it slips beyond the priorities of record. This slipping is subtle. There is no moment when scribes decide not to write about origins. There is only a steady narrowing of attention. Each tablet answers an immediate need. Each copied text reinforces what has proven useful. Over time, the archive grows precise and deep, yet bounded. The silence at its edge becomes invisible from within. The people living inside this system do not experience the silence as loss. Their world functions. Order persists. The absence of a named beginning does not weaken belief. It strengthens it by removing uncertainty. If the world has always been ordered, then disorder becomes an interruption rather than a threat to existence itself. This orientation also shapes how change is understood. Innovation rarely presents itself as new. It appears as correction, alignment, restoration of an older balance. Even when something truly unprecedented occurs, language bends to frame it as return. The past becomes a reservoir of legitimacy rather than a subject of investigation. Over generations, this framing reshapes identity. People come to see themselves not as founders, but as custodians. Their responsibility is not to imagine a different world, but to maintain the one they inhabit. Curiosity about ultimate origins yields to concern for immediate stability. Questions that do not serve maintenance fall away. Archaeology suggests that this custodial mindset was earned through experience. The landscape of southern Mesopotamia offered little forgiveness. Shifting rivers, salinized fields, and sudden floods demanded constant adjustment. Communities that survived did so by refining practices, not by preserving stories. Adaptation became a way of life. When adaptation is constant, beginnings blur. There is no clear moment when one can say, "Here is where everything started." There are only thresholds crossed gradually, often without awareness. Agriculture deepens, settlements thicken, social roles specialize. At no point does the present announce itself as new. It simply becomes more complex. Writing arrives after this complexity reaches a tipping point. It does not illuminate the path taken to arrive there. It stabilizes what exists now. The first beginning lies behind layers of lived adjustment, too dispersed to crystallize into narrative. This dispersion explains why later readers struggle. Accustomed to histories that begin with declarations, they encounter a record that starts mid-motion. The effect is disorienting. Systems appear without preface. Authority descends without justification. Time stretches backward without resolution. Yet this disorientation may be the point at which modern expectation collides with ancient experience. We assume that meaning requires origin. The Sumerians assumed that meaning required continuity. Their silence reflects that assumption, not a lack of thought. The silence also reveals the cost of preservation. To hold a world together across generations, something must be allowed to fade. Explanation gives way to repetition. Curiosity yields to caution. Over time, these trade-offs become invisible, embedded in habit and belief. Later cultures inherit the result without witnessing the trade. They see only the silence and feel compelled to fill it. They imagine lost texts, erased truths, forgotten revelations. Sometimes these imaginings say more about later insecurity than about ancient intent. The Sumerian record may not be incomplete in the way we fear. It may be complete according to its own purpose. It preserves a world that has already learned how to survive without explaining how it first came into being. And yet, the question does not disappear. It changes shape. If the first beginning was dispersed across lived adaptation, rather than concentrated in a single moment, then searching for it in texts may always disappoint. It may exist instead as a pattern of choices made under pressure, encoded into systems that feel ancient even when their origins cannot be named. In that sense, the silence around the first beginning does not point backward to a hidden event. It points inward, toward a way of understanding history itself. A reminder that some pasts were not meant to be told, only lived, and that the deepest foundations of civilization may lie precisely where words never learned how to follow. There comes a point where the silence itself begins to feel intentional, not because it was designed that way, but because it endured. The longer it survives, the more it gathers meaning. In the Sumerian record, this endurance is striking. Thousands of tablets survive, dense with detail, yet none pause to frame the world's first breath. This is not an oversight repeated by chance. It is a pattern that holds. Patterns form under pressure. In southern Mesopotamia, pressure came from the land. Rivers that nourished also erased. Fields demanded constant care. Cities depended on cooperation fragile enough to collapse if mismanaged. In such conditions, memory became a tool sharpened by necessity. What helped maintain balance was preserved. What did not was allowed to fade. This sharpening of memory explains why Sumerian texts feel selective rather than incomplete. They do not read like fragments of a broken archive. They read like the product of careful focus. The scribes who shaped them were not attempting to describe everything that had ever happened. They were ensuring that what mattered most would not be forgotten again. Again suggests a prior loss, not a single dramatic erasure, but a cumulative thinning of remembrance. Floods that washed away settlements, migrations that fractured communities, generations forced to adapt quickly, carrying forward only what could be retained under stress. Over time, such experiences teach restraint. Memory becomes conservative. It stops reaching for what cannot be held securely. In this environment, the idea of a definitive first beginning becomes fragile. If catastrophe has already severed memory once, anchoring identity to an origin risks repeating that loss. Better to anchor identity to continuity itself, to say not where we began, but how we persist. This may be why Sumerian identity feels so procedural. One belongs by performing the correct rituals, honoring the correct gods, measuring fields correctly, speaking the right words at the right time. Belonging is enacted rather than narrated. The past legitimizes through repetition, not through story. Such an identity does not require a creation myth in the modern sense. It requires assurance that the present aligns with what has always worked. Writing becomes the guarantor of that alignment. It records precedent. It fixes boundaries. It does not speculate beyond them. Yet speculation never disappears entirely. It survives at the edges, in mythic imagery that hints without explaining. Waters before gods, kings before memory, time before scale. These hints do not resolve the question of beginnings. They suspend it, allowing it to exist without threatening order. Suspension may be the key. Rather than answering the question of origin, Sumerian culture holds it open in silence. The absence becomes a container, not a void. It marks a place where certainty is neither claimed nor denied. This approach contrasts sharply with later traditions that seek closure. As centuries pass and disruptions intensify, cultures grow less comfortable with open questions. They seek firmer ground. Creation stories sharpen. Origins become singular, decisive, absolute. The universe must begin at a moment that can be named. The Sumerian record resists this impulse. It offers no such moment. Instead, it offers continuity thick enough to stand on its own. The world has weight. It does not need justification. For modern listeners, this resistance can feel unsettling. We are accustomed to explanations that start at the beginning and move forward. When that structure fails, we suspect omission. We assume something is missing because our own frameworks depend on origins to function. But the Sumerian framework did not. It functioned on balance, repetition, and survival. Its silence reflects those priorities faithfully. It is not a gap waiting to be filled. It is a boundary drawn by experience. Crossing that boundary may not be possible with evidence alone. Archaeology can reveal older layers. Linguistics can trace patterns. Comparative mythology can suggest parallels. Yet none of these can recover a moment that may never have existed as a moment. If the first beginning was not a single event, but a long unfolding of adaptation, then the search for it as a story may always fail. The silence would then be the most accurate record available. This possibility reframes the discomfort we feel. The unease may not come from what the Sumerians failed to tell us, but from what they understood and accepted. That some truths do not survive transition, that some beginnings dissolve into process. That continuity can matter more than explanation. In accepting this, the silence shifts from obstacle to guide. It invites us to question our own assumptions about history. Do we seek beginnings because they clarify the past, or because they comfort the present? Do we demand origins because they are necessary, or because they reassure us that meaning is fixed? The Sumerian record does not answer these questions. It does something quieter. It demonstrates a way of living without answers to them, a way of organizing the world around what endures rather than what explains. And perhaps that is its most enduring legacy. Not a missing beginning, but a reminder that history doesn't always offer the kind of certainty we expect. Sometimes it offers silence instead, asking us not to fill it, but to listen to what it reveals about the limits of memory, the weight of survival, and the strange possibility that meaning can exist even when origins remain unnamed. As the record carries on without an origin, another layer of meaning begins to surface, one that is easy to overlook. Silence, in this context, is not only about what is forgotten, it is also about what is protected. In Sumer, knowledge that could destabilize order was not necessarily dangerous because it was false, but because it invited reflection where action was required. In a world shaped by precarious balance, reflection had limits. This does not mean Sumerian thought was shallow. On the contrary, it reveals a deep awareness of consequence. Every ritual assumed that the universe responded to precision. Every omen implied that disorder could be read, interpreted, and perhaps delayed. Such a worldview leaves little room for abstract speculation about beginnings. To ask why the universe exists does not help one predict whether the river will flood tomorrow. Instead, attention settles on thresholds that matter: day and night, dry season and flood season, favor and displeasure. These are the edges where survival is decided. Writing, shaped by this attention, becomes a technology of thresholds. It marks transitions, obligations, and signs. It does not venture beyond them. This threshold-based thinking reshapes memory. The past is remembered not as a continuous story, but as precedent. What happened before matters only insofar as it informs what must be done now. A past that cannot guide action fades naturally. The first beginning offers no precedent. It does not teach how to respond when balance falters. It becomes quietly unnecessary. This practical orientation carries ethical weight. Sumerian law codes do not present justice as innovation. They present it as correction. Harm disrupts balance. Judgment restores it. Even punishment is framed as realignment rather than retribution. The world is imagined as something that can be tuned back into harmony if handled correctly. Such an imagination does not benefit from stories of absolute origin. Origins imply rupture, a moment when order did not yet exist. That implication weakens the sense that order is fundamental. For a society that depends on believing in order's permanence, such weakness is costly. Yet permanence is never absolute. The Sumerians knew this well. Floods came, cities fell, dynasties ended. But each collapse was followed by continuity of form. Temples were rebuilt, titles returned, ritual language persisted. The structure survived even when the structure's bearers changed. This resilience may explain why the first beginning never demanded articulation. The world, as experienced, did not feel newly made. It felt repeatedly restored. Restoration became the dominant narrative, overshadowing any memory of initial formation. Archaeological layers echo this rhythm. Ruin does not lead to abandonment forever. It leads to rebuilding nearby or atop the same ground. Even when populations shift, spatial memory remains. Sacred sites endure through reconstruction. Place remembers even when people forget. In such a setting, the idea of a single first moment dissolves. The past stretches backward not as a line, but as a density. Each layer presses into the next. There is no clear boundary where one can say, "Here it began." There is only a growing weight of experience. This weight is what writing captures imperfectly. Tablets preserve the surface of a world already shaped by pressure beneath. They cannot reach the deepest layers because those layers were never organized as story. They existed as response, adaptation, and habit. The Sumerian silence thus marks the edge between lived history and recorded history. Beyond that edge, memory does not vanish, but it transforms. It becomes environmental, embodied, collective, rather than textual. Writing can gesture toward it, but not recover it. Modern attempts to fill this silence often misunderstand its nature. We imagine a missing chapter that could be restored if only the right tablet were found. Yet the silence may not correspond to a chapter at all. It may correspond to a mode of existence that did not produce chapters. This realization carries a quiet warning. Not all pasts can be retrieved through accumulation of evidence. Some are lost not because they were erased, but because they were never fixed in a form that could survive transition. The desire to recover them may reflect more about our own need for narrative closure than about ancient intention. The Sumerian world did not require closure. It required continuity. Its silence reflects that requirement faithfully. It does not invite resolution. It invites endurance. As this understanding settles, the question of the first beginning softens. It no longer demands an answer in the usual sense. Instead, it becomes a lens through which to examine how civilizations remember and why they choose to forget. If Sumer teaches anything through its silence, it may be this: that history is not only what is recorded, but what is allowed to fade so that life can continue. And as we listen to what remains unsaid, we are reminded that some of the most influential forces shaping civilization operate quietly beneath language, leaving behind not stories but structures that still hold us centuries later. As the silence surrounding Sumer's earliest past grows more familiar, another dimension begins to emerge. One that does not belong solely to texts or archaeology, but to the behavior of civilizations that follow patterns long after they have forgotten why. When later empires inherited the Sumerian world, they did not inherit its origins. They inherited its structures, its rituals, its cosmology of maintenance, its vision of authority that descends rather than arises. These elements persist even as languages shift and dynasties fall, suggesting that some forms of memory travel more effectively through imitation than through narrative. Akkad, Babylon, Assyria, all absorbed Sumer's worldview into their own frameworks, sometimes consciously, sometimes unconsciously. They adopted temples as centers of cosmic alignment, not innovation. They retained the idea that kingship is bestowed, not achieved. Even when empires expanded far beyond the scale of the old city-states, the basic shape of governance remained rooted in assumptions inherited from a world already ancient. This inheritance traveled through scribal tradition, ritual repetition, and the physical spaces themselves. Ziggurats rebuilt on foundations older than any living memory, canals maintained along paths carved by centuries of habit. Yet none of these successor cultures attempted to supply the missing first beginning. They elaborated mythic cycles, refined genealogies of gods, and sharpened theological conflict. But even their most ambitious cosmologies stopped short of naming an absolute start. Instead, they intensified the motif of rearrangement. Older forces subdued, waters divided, heavens assigned their courses. The idea that order emerged from struggle remained, but the moment before struggle remained unspoken. This restraint hints at an inherited comfort with ambiguity. Whatever lay beyond the rearrangement of the cosmos, did not require articulation for society to function. Even when political ambition demanded divine validation, rulers located legitimacy in descent, not creation. To rule was to stand in a line extending backward into a horizon too distant to see, rather than to declare a new moment of beginning. But something begins to shift once these civilizations encounter crisis, deep enough to rupture continuity. When Assyrian palaces burn, when Babylon rises and falls, when entire populations are displaced, the silence that once stabilized identity begins to feel exposed. Explanation grows heavier, myths stretch further. Some traditions, encountering profound fragmentation, finally attempt what Sumer and its successors never did. They narrate an absolute creation, a moment when everything springs from nothing. This shift is not unique to the ancient Near East. It appears around the world when societies encounter prolonged rupture. Catastrophe creates hunger for clarity. The deeper the break, the more necessary a beginning becomes. Origins reassure by placing meaning at a stable point outside the chaos. They promise that even if the present is fractured, the universe itself is not. In this light, the Sumerian silence acquires new significance. It offers a glimpse of a pre-rupture worldview, a way of being in which existence does not require justification, only alignment. Meaning flows forward through obligation, ritual, and relationship, rather than backward through cosmic explanation. A world held together by balance rather than origin can survive many disruptions without needing to reimagine itself entirely. But that resilience carries a cost. When later ages look back, they see form without genesis. They find systems without prefaces. They encounter knowledge refined yet detached from its earliest context. The silence that protected Sumerian identity becomes a riddle for those who inherit its remnants. Archaeology exposes the depth of this detachment. Tools appear refined without known prototypes. Settlement patterns shift without clear causes. Artistic styles emerge already confident. These phenomena invite speculation. Lost civilizations, erased histories, forgotten teachers. Some theories reach far, others remain grounded. But all stem from the same discomfort. The recognition that the earliest chapters are not recoverable through text alone. Perhaps they were never written because the people who lived them did not experience them as beginnings. They experienced them as responses to water, soil, sky, and the unpredictable conditions that shaped survival. Responses do not announce themselves as the start of civilization. They become civilization only in hindsight. As we continue searching for the missing first beginning, the silence grows more instructive. It asks whether the concept of a singular origin belongs to the world we inhabit, not the world the Sumerians inhabited. It invites us to consider that the earliest civilizations may not have needed the answers we now demand. And if that is true, then another question rises quietly. What does it reveal about us that we cannot accept a past without a defined start, even when the people who lived closest to that past never asked for one? As the trail stretches further back into the half-light of early civilization, another presence begins to shape the story: geology itself. Long before scribes pressed reeds into clay, the earth was already recording what no human language could hold. Layers of silt thicken in sudden bands. Shorelines retreat. Marshes rise where plains once lay open. These shifts do not speak in narrative form, yet they form a chronology of disruption that early societies inherited without the means to articulate. Across southern Mesopotamia, traces of ancient floods appear not as mythic extravagance, but as geological fact. Some layers correspond to seasonal inundations, others are deeper, more forceful, swallowing entire settlements and leaving behind deposits out of scale with ordinary cycles. None of these layers point to a single universal catastrophe, but together they reveal an ancient world shaped repeatedly by upheaval. For communities living through such events, stability would never have felt permanent, and remembering the deep past would have been less urgent than surviving the next recurrence. This may help explain why the Sumerian texts remain so steady in tone even when describing disruption. The Great Flood appears not as the first catastrophe, but as the one that memory solidified. It stands as a boundary beyond which narrative cannot reach, not because nothing existed before, but because too much had already been lost to preserve in story. When life resumes after such an event, what matters most is restoration, rebuilding canals, redistributing land, re-establishing ritual. Origins do not return. They sink beneath the weight of necessity. Archaeology reinforces this idea of submerged memory. Beneath every great city lie older foundations, then older still, each bearing signs of adaptation. The earliest levels do not reveal sudden invention. They reveal learning how to control water, how to shape clay into brick, how to manage resources across seasons. None of these skills emerge fully formed, yet by the time writing appears, their origins have dissolved into practice. Civilization arrives already skilled because the unrecorded centuries that refined those skills left no language behind. Environmental instability does more than erase material traces. It reshapes how people understand time. In regions where rivers change course, where settlements must be moved, where entire communities are forced to relocate, beginnings lose their symbolic power. Life becomes a matter of endurance. Every generation may feel closer to recovery than Genesis. In such a world, the question of a first beginning becomes almost irrelevant, a philosophical luxury belonging to those whose landscapes provide more stability than threat. This instability also shapes religious expression. Gods of storm, wind, and river are not creators, but regulators. They manage forces that would otherwise overwhelm. Their authority emerges from control, not genesis. Humans, in turn, serve by reenacting rituals that help maintain balance. The cosmic architecture mirrors the landscape, precarious yet continuous. What happened before the gods assumed their roles is left unspoken, perhaps because such a question hints at a time when the world was less governable, less predictable, less survivable. Even early trade networks suggest inherited connections. Obsidian from Anatolia, lapis from Afghanistan, shells from distant shores. They appear in Sumer not as novelties, but as components of an established exchange system. Such networks do not form overnight. They require trust, repetition, and shared understanding among peoples who left little written record. By the time Sumerian scribes document trade, the system already feels old. The beginning, once again, is somewhere beyond reach. Modern readers, confronted with this combination of archaeological depth and textual silence, often imagine missing civilizations. An erased progenitor, a forgotten master culture, a vanished chapter of human development. These theories, some grounded, others speculative, arise from an understandable discomfort. When the pieces do not fit neatly, we assume an absent hinge. But the silence may not signal a hidden predecessor. It may signal a world shaped by slow, repeated, unrecorded convergence. A kind of origin that resists storytelling because it was never concentrated into a moment. If the first beginning was not a singular event, but an accumulation of responses to shifting land, shifting water, shifting community, then it becomes clear why no text remembers it. Stories preserve moments. Processes preserve themselves without narrative. And civilizations built on long processes may not even perceive the lack of a starting point. They simply continue. Yet the more we accept this possibility, the more another question quietly emerges. If the Sumerians inherited a world already dense with forgotten experience, how many layers of human learning lie beneath our own? And how much of what we call progress rests upon foundations far older, far more eroded than we have ever been taught to imagine? The closer we draw to the edge of what can be known, the more the silence begins to resemble a presence rather than a void. It waits beneath the tablets, beneath the foundations of cities, beneath the long arc of traditions carried forward without recollection of their earliest shape. And as we stand at this threshold, where evidence grows thin and interpretation grows heavy, we begin to see how the Sumerian silence is not merely a gap in memory, but a mirror reflecting the fragility of all recorded history. For even as the Sumerians stabilized their world through writing, they could not escape the deeper truth that everything they preserved was already the survivor of something else. Every brick of Uruk rested atop older walls. Every ritual gesture had once been improvised in response to forces no longer remembered. Every measure of time had been refined through generations who never pressed a single sign into clay. Writing may protect what remains, but it cannot revive what vanished before it began. The later centuries only sharpen this paradox. As empires expanded and scribal traditions deepened, the Sumerian worldview was absorbed into larger political and cosmological systems. But absorption is not the same as understanding. Akkadian, Babylonian, and Assyrian thinkers inherited the form of Sumerian memory, without recovering its lost contents. They elaborated myths, expanded genealogies of gods, traced cosmic battles, and constructed elaborate narratives of divine order. But none of these efforts resolved the silence underneath. The first beginning remained untouched, like a sealed chamber no myth dared to enter. Some scholars have noted how ancient texts across cultures treat the deepest past with a strange mixture of reverence and indifference. They gesture toward an origin without attempting to illuminate it, as if acknowledging that the earliest layers of reality belong to forces beyond human capacity to narrate. In Mesopotamia, this impulse appears not as mystification, but as acceptance. The earliest waters exist, the earliest rulers exist, the earliest cycles exist. They require no explanation, because explanation does not strengthen the world. Only alignment does. Yet as modern readers, we struggle with this acceptance. The absence of origin feels like an unfinished equation. We look to geology, archaeology, and comparative myth in search of a missing variable. We seek older settlements, earlier migrations, forgotten climate events, even speculative predecessors. But each discovery, each shift in coastline, each buried settlement, each anomalous artifact, only deepens the sense that the earliest movements of civilization were too fluid to ever be captured in a story. They leave behind patterns, not beginnings, and perhaps that is the most difficult lesson, that not all truths crystallize into narrative. Some remain dispersed, like silt carried by shifting rivers, forming new layers even as they erase old ones. Civilization itself may be one of those truths, not a single spark, but a slow accumulation of adjustments made under pressure. Not a story, but a sediment. As these reflections gather, the central question that has driven this journey returns, softened but still unresolved. Why do Sumerian texts never describe the first beginning? Because the first beginning may never have been a moment at all. Because the earliest experiences of humanity may have been shaped by forces too large, too slow, or too fragile to survive in words. Because writing entered history not to explain how the world began, but to prevent the world from forgetting how to continue. And so the silence does not answer us. It invites us. It reminds us that every civilization, including our own, stands on layers of unrecorded experience. That what we know is always less than what allowed us to know anything at all. That memory is not a complete archive, but a selection shaped by survival. As we reach the edge of this long exploration, one final question waits, not as an ending, but as an opening. If the Sumerians lived in the middle of a story whose beginning they could not name, then where, exactly, do we stand in our own? And how many of our foundations lie hidden beneath us, shaping our world silently, just as theirs once shaped them? And now, as the echoes of ancient clay settle into stillness, the long journey through Sumer's quiet begins to fade into the darkness from which it emerged. We have wandered across flood-scarred plains, descended through layers of forgotten cities, listened to gods who manage rather than create, and followed systems of knowledge that survived long after their origin dissolved. What began as a question about a missing beginning has unfolded into something much larger, a recognition that not all foundations can be named, and not all histories offer the comfort of a first page. Across every tablet, every ruin, every silence, a single truth has whispered itself again and again, that the earliest past is not a story waiting to be restored, but a landscape shaped by forces that memory was never built to carry. The Sumerians did not withhold their beginning. They simply lived in a world where beginnings were dispersed, where continuity mattered more than genesis, where survival carved deeper marks than explanation ever could. In their silence, they left us not an absence, but a reflection, a reminder that what we inherit is never the whole of what once was, and that every civilization stands on foundations older than it can name. As you leave this quiet stretch of Mesopotamian night behind, let the stillness linger. Let the unanswered questions breathe. Let the silence remind you that history is not a complete map, but a constellation of fragments, each one illuminated by what remains and shadowed by what was lost. And if you find yourself wondering what other worlds lie buried beneath the stories we take for granted, worlds shaped by resilience, by forgetting, by the slow gravity of time, know that you are already listening with the kind of curiosity that keeps the past alive. Thank you for drifting with us through these ancient corridors of thought. If you wish to continue exploring mysteries wrapped in history, memory, and shadow, you are always welcome here. This has been the Cryptic Realm channel. Rest well, breathe slowly, and let the questions follow you gently into sleep, because the deepest stories often begin where memory ends.